In the early 1970s, Bruce Lee entered a Tokyo dojo, not as a celebrity, but as a guest. The air was unnervingly still, as if the room itself had held its breath. Witnesses later said that everything changed in a heartbeat, set off by a single movement so subtle most didn't even register it. A faint shift of weight, a tilt of a shoulder, enough to ripple through the disciplined silence and alter the balance of the space. The tension wasn't loud, but it was palpable, threading through every eye, every taut muscle, every careful inhale. To understand why that almost invisible motion carried the force it did, you have to look back a few steps, to the moment before anything happened, when presence alone began to speak louder than words or strikes. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Bruce stepped into the dojo, the wooden floor cool under his bare feet, and the familiar scent of aged tatami filled the air. He was a guest, though the welcome was quiet. A simple nod from the master, a fleeting glance from the students. No applause, no fanfare. Just the measured rhythm of disciplined movement, the kind that demanded attention without spectacle. The room was a grid of practitioners, bodies aligned in parallel, each exhale sharp and deliberate. Bruce took his place at the edge, off to the side, removing his shoes with care, feeling the slight give of the floor beneath his toes. From this distance, he observed. Hands moved with precise intent, each strike hitting a makiwara with a muffled, resonant thud. A few students glanced toward him surreptitiously, measuring, assessing, perhaps questioning his presence. Their eyes flickered back to their forms the moment he shifted his gaze, subtle but watchful. Every sound, wood creaking under movement, the faint rustle of clothing, a distant metallic chime beyond the partition, registered in his mind, catalogued without distraction. Bruce's breath was slow, deliberate, intentionally out of step with the controlled cadence around him. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with training, a quiet, almost imperceptible hum beneath the room's disciplined surface. The door closed behind him with a slightly heavier thud than necessary, a sound that seemed to mark a threshold. He noticed a figure not engaging in the movements, a shadow at the edge of the room. They did not train, did not observe openly. They simply existed, a presence threaded into the patterns of the space. The subtle misalignment of their posture, the near imperceptible shift of weight, pulled Bruce's attention without need for confrontation. Even the slightest gesture could betray intent, and he noted each one. The flicker of an eyelid, the minute adjustment of a shoulder, the quiet scrape of a foot against wood. Some expected him to step onto the tatami, to join the ritual. But that invitation never came. The omission itself carried weight, a silent statement of boundaries and hierarchy. Bruce acknowledged it without reaction. His role here was not to dominate, nor to display skill. He was an observer, a careful presence in a room governed by tradition. The makiwara strikes continued, each one a sharp punctuation in the otherwise hushed environment. The shuffling of students' feet in socks, the almost imperceptible intake of breath, the rustle of kimono fabric as someone shifted their stance, all layered into the quiet orchestration of discipline. Bruce's gaze drifted to the peripheral edges, toward the figure in the shadows, noting how even the light fell unevenly across the floorboards. There was a subtle tension threading through the room, a latent expectation without articulation. Bruce sensed that this was more than observation. It was a test. He felt it in the space between movements, in the micro-pauses, in the barely audible thrum of anticipation. Every detail mattered. The alignment of hands, the angle of a wrist, the subtle shift in balance. The room seemed to inhale and hold itself in sync with him, though no one acknowledged the synchronization. And in that suspended moment, Bruce realized he was not merely being watched, he was being measured. Yet nothing had begun, not truly. The first gesture, the initial motion that would define the coming encounter, had not yet arrived. He remained still, present, a calm observer in a charged space, fully aware that the true test was imminent, and that when it came, it would leave no room for error, no margin for misjudgment. The training continued, but the rhythm fractured. Subtle shifts that did not go unnoticed. Bruce's eyes traced every motion, not for technique alone, but for inconsistencies. One figure moved differently, too quietly, too smoothly, a fluidity that did not belong to a student. It was almost imperceptible, yet in the stillness of the dojo, it was impossible to ignore. According to those present, this presence moved with a silence that even the strictest discipline could not explain. Each pause of the master, each measured inhale, seemed to hang in anticipation, as if waiting for a signal that never came. Bruce adjusted his posture, imperceptibly shifting his center of gravity, a micro-movement that revealed nothing to the untrained eye. His gaze no longer rested solely on the tatami, where disciplined forms unfolded. It drifted along the edges, sweeping the shadows, catching the smallest motion at the periphery. A faint scuff of a sock on wood, the almost invisible drag of fabric, the subtle dip of a shoulder, all spoke to him in a language of intention. The air was dense with tension. Students, usually attuned to the master's rhythm, hesitated mid-strike. Breathing, normally synchronized, now fractured, a collective inhalation followed by a silence that carried weight. Outside, the faint murmur of the street intruded, distant and unreal, yet it emphasized the isolation within these walls. Every sound, every pause, was amplified in significance. Bruce perceived the potential for sudden violence, not personal, not yet, but toward the sanctity of the dojo itself. This realization brought a sharpened focus. Any reaction would be visible, and in a room where respect was measured by control, even the slightest misstep could be misinterpreted. His hands rested lightly on his knees, fingers barely flexing, ready but not rigid. The shift of his body was minimal, a silent preparation for what might unfold, without signaling challenge or fear. Through the shadows, the quiet figure's movements remained unsettlingly precise. Bruce noted the imperceptible tensing of muscles, the abnormal angles of wrist and elbow, the subtle pressure in the stance that marked intention. This was no mere observation. It was a poised readiness, contained but undeniably present. Bruce's awareness extended to the smallest details: the rhythm of his own pulse, the faint creak of wood beneath weight, the scent of sweat mingled with aged timber. Time seemed to fragment. Moments stretched and contracted in irregular patterns. Each micro-movement became a potential trigger, each hesitation a signifier of risk. Bruce remained seated, still an observer in appearance, but his mind mapped every line, every vector, every possible motion. It was clear. This was no ordinary training. The tension had moved beyond instruction, beyond demonstration. He now understood that if action were to occur, it would be swift, without warning, and confined entirely to the unspoken rules of presence and control. Bruce did not flinch, did not react overtly, yet the entirety of his being was attuned. Every inch of the room, every shadow, every sound was catalogued, measured, and anticipated. And in that quiet, deliberate watchfulness, Bruce acknowledged the certainty. If anything happened here, it would happen in a heartbeat. The challenge was no longer hypothetical. It lingered, latent and inevitable, and Bruce's preparedness became the only barrier between the unspoken threat and the sanctity of the space around him. The silence thickened, almost tangible, as one of the masters stepped back, creating a narrow corridor of unbroken sight between Bruce and the shadowed figure. In that instant, the room seemed to constrict. Air grew heavier, each breath drawn with more awareness than the last. Witnesses later described the shift as sudden, though subtle, like a pulse traveling through the wood, through the tatami, a vibration only the attentive could feel. The shadow at the edge of the dojo slid imperceptibly along the floor, blending with the dim corners, yet its presence was undeniable. A calculated stillness, poised yet unreadable. Bruce rose, measured and fluid, not hastily, not as a gesture of confrontation. His movement did not demand attention, rather, it claimed it through quiet authority. Eyes trained on him flickered briefly. Students held their breath, their posture taut with unspoken anticipation. He did not meet the shadowed gaze directly, but his awareness encompassed every angle, every subtle shift of weight, every possible vector of motion. A simple tilt of the head, the micro-bend of the knees, the fraction of a step, each choice a thread in a web of control that spread throughout the room. The air was punctuated by the soft scrape of fabric against floor, the almost inaudible flex of muscles under tension, the tiny, deliberate adjustments of posture. Even the normally steady rhythm of the master's breathing altered, a pause that carried more weight than any spoken command. The shadow moved again, imperceptibly, closing the distance without apparent intent, yet every millimeter was laden with potential. Bruce's own micro-adjustments were invisible to anyone untrained. A slight rotation of the torso, a subtle shift of weight from heel to toe, a hand brushing just short of the knee. These movements were unremarkable in isolation, yet together they constituted a full mapping of reaction, control, and equilibrium. He understood fully. Contact, once made, would be swift and decisive, yet it need not be violent. Restraint could accomplish more than force. The students' reactions intensified. One or two exhaled slowly through their noses, barely audible, betraying their awareness of the compressed energy in the space. The master's gaze, focused elsewhere, hinted at recognition of a boundary crossed, yet no intervention came. Every micro-moment hung suspended, a pause before a step, the fraction of a second in which balance could shift, and perception could become reality. Bruce sensed the inevitability of the encounter. Avoidance was no longer an option. The space dictated interaction. Yet he carried with him a principle. That motion could assert authority without diminishing the dignity of another. Each micro-decision, how to position his feet, the angle of his shoulders, the arc of his attention, was a negotiation with risk itself. One miscalculation could escalate, yet deliberate control offered the possibility of resolution without spectacle. As the distance closed, the tension reached a subtle peak. Bruce felt it in the alignment of his spine, the gentle flex of his calves, the measured cadence of his breath. The shadow responded to forces unseen, and for the briefest moment, the room existed in suspension. Two presences, poised at the threshold of action, the smallest gestures pregnant with consequence. Stillness dominated, yet it was a dynamic stillness, alive with potential. The choice of the first move was no longer theoretical. It loomed, inevitable, a singular point from which all subsequent motion would radiate. And in that concentrated awareness, Bruce understood. In the seconds to come, every element of training, of observation, of restraint would be tested. Nothing overt had yet occurred, and yet everything had shifted. The space between Bruce and the shadow narrowed by barely a step, Yet the change carried the weight of inevitability. The master's eyes dropped briefly, a subtle concession of responsibility, leaving Bruce alone in silent negotiation with the presence across from him. The figure shifted stance, immediately clear in its unnatural tension, an angle in the wrist and shoulder that betrayed intent. It was not a position of practice or demonstration. It was preparation, measured and deliberate, yet restrained. Bruce responded with almost imperceptible motion. He tilted his torso slightly, a minor adjustment that altered the line of engagement without signaling aggression. His eyes, calm and unflinching, never met those of the shadow, yet every movement was a claim of spatial authority. The students remained frozen, breaths shallow, hands tensed at their sides. Even the air seemed to compress, carrying the subtle vibrations of focus and expectation. Every sound was amplified by awareness, the soft give of the tatami beneath weight, a nervous swallow in the corner, the faint drag of fabric along floor. Bruce's body absorbed these details without tension. His hands rested lightly, ready yet relaxed, tracing the invisible geometry of the room. Time elongated in micro-increments. A heartbeat might have been 3 beats. A step might have been a crawl. Every minuscule gesture of the shadow, pressure applied through toes, a shoulder ever so slightly rotated, a wrist flexed, was noted, weighed, counterbalanced. The realization crystallized. This was no ritual challenge. The dojo's integrity, its unspoken code, was under scrutiny. Any overt reaction could be interpreted as violation or provocation. Bruce recognized that the potential for violence existed without announcement, without rhythm or signal, in the quietest fraction of a moment. And yet, his control was total. He moved in anticipation, not reaction, maintaining poise without dominance. Students' micro-reactions were instructive. A subtle intake of breath, a slight shift of weight, the almost invisible flinch of a finger. Bruce's presence acted as a counterpoint, absorbing and balancing the tension. He did not attack, did not retreat, but occupied the space with a precision that spoke louder than motion. Each incremental adjustment of his body, each slight rotation, each recalibration of center of gravity, was a silent message. Authority through awareness, control through composure. The shadow's posture betrayed minute impulses, almost accidental, yet deliberate. Bruce's attention catalogued them. A flex of the ankle, a fraction of lean, the angle of the wrist under the kimono. All these signals converged in an intricate map of potential energy, a compressed dialogue without words. The air vibrated with it, felt more than heard, attention so exacting it bordered on palpable. In this compressed, anticipatory moment, the dojo itself seemed to hold its breath. Every element, wood, tatami, fabric, muscle, perception, was attuned to the impending motion. Bruce understood that a single, almost invisible impulse could initiate the sequence, and that his choice, though silent, would define not victory, but the integrity of the encounter. Everything had been set. The final spark was forming, a subtle impulse ready to trigger the first move. And Bruce, poised with the utmost patience and precision, remained entirely calm, entirely present, fully aware that the coming action would test both restraint and skill, and that in less than a heartbeat, the outcome would be determined. The shadow shifted forward, barely perceptible, a fraction of motion that seemed accidental, yet carried intent. Observers would later describe it as a misstep, though it was anything but. Bruce registered it instantly. The movement registered before even the untrained eye could perceive it. He did not flinch, did not retreat, did not strike. Instead, he subtly altered his line of balance, an imperceptible redirection that preserved both distance and control. The space between them felt suddenly compressed, yet no body collided. The master's shoulders tensed sharply, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's gravity. Yet he remained inert, neither intervening nor speaking. In the dojo, time fragmented. A single heartbeat stretched into what seemed like several, a pause suspended in the precision of awareness. The microsecond of the shadow's advance carried all the weight of potential energy, and Bruce's body responded with a preternatural economy of motion. Every angle, every weight shift, every subtle flex of muscle was a decision, made to neutralize force without confrontation. Bruce's awareness extended outward, mapping every element of the dojo. The creak of floorboards under the weight of small adjustments, the rustle of fabric as a sleeve brushed a thigh, the faint scent of sweat and old wood, all became coordinates in his mental landscape. The shadow's micro-movement, a slight rotation of the shoulder and a subtle flex in the wrist, suggested escalation. Bruce's adjustment was minimal, almost casual, yet it ensured that the vector of potential aggression was redirected. The tension between them was a living entity. Air seemed denser, heavier, every inhale drawn with conscious deliberation. Muscles tensed, then relaxed in infinitesimal measures, calibrating for action that might never arrive. Students' eyes widened slightly. Some barely exhaled, catching the shift, while others remained frozen, their instinctive reactions contained by discipline. The room itself seemed to contract, the distance between Bruce and the shadowed figure collapsing into a thin line of imminent engagement. In this drawn-out instant, Bruce understood the stakes. Any overt move could be misread as aggression. Any hesitation might be seen as weakness. Yet the situation demanded resolution, and he would act in a manner that preserved dignity for both himself and the other. The dojo's order, the silent hierarchy, depended on the precision of his response. Every micro-action, from the tilt of his foot to the subtle rotation of his torso, was a negotiation between potential violence and controlled authority. A breath caught somewhere in the room. A finger twitched ever so slightly. Bruce's focus tightened, his peripheral awareness extending to shadows, to edges of mats, to the faintest shifts in balance. The moment was compressed, distilled into a single elongated second where motion, intention, and perception converged. It was clear now. The encounter had begun, though no blow had landed, no foot had moved overtly. Bruce felt it in the alignment of his spine, the calibration of his center of gravity, the careful, almost invisible positioning of his limbs. The first act had been set in motion, silent yet definitive. He understood the imperative. Act with precision, maintain control, neutralize without diminishing, and wait for the split-second opportunity that would resolve the tension without spectacle. In that taut, charged instant, Bruce's awareness was complete. The dojo held its breath, the shadow's advance continued, and every micro-moment carried a weight that would define not victory, but the integrity of the space, the balance between force and restraint. All preparation, all observation, all subtle calculation had led to this threshold. The action to come would unfold in less than a heartbeat, and its outcome would hinge entirely on timing and measured execution. The shadow's movement crystallized, no longer a tentative shift, but a deliberate push forward, minimal in scale yet unmistakably aggressive. It was the kind of motion that most observers would miss entirely, registering only as a subtle misalignment in stance, a twitch of muscle, a fraction of weight applied incorrectly. Bruce did not step back. He did not launch an attack. He moved sideways, scarcely more than a single fraction of a step, his body responding with absolute precision to the imperceptible vector of force. His hand traced the shortest path toward the threat. Not a swing, not a strike, but a guided intercept, barely more than a touch. The contact lasted less than a heartbeat, seemingly accidental, yet its effect was complete. The shadow's balance shifted before the mind could register the cause. Muscles tensed, a pivot aborted mid-motion, and the body halted as if a switch had been flipped. There was no collapse, no dramatic fall, only the sudden suspension of forward momentum, the potential for escalation neutralized in silence. Observers would recall the moment differently, some slower to understand, others sensing only the tension dissipate. Bruce's motion was invisible in its economy, a perfect illustration of control without showmanship. The room, still taut with anticipation, registered the shift as a near imperceptible tremor in the air, a recalibration of energy that rippled outward through the student's nervous system. Hearts, already elevated from suspended expectation, began to relax in uneven pulses. The faintest sounds marked the intervention. A low, muted tap of fabric brushing against another, a brief exhalation from Bruce, the soft friction of foot against tatami. Each micro-sound seemed louder in the charged environment, yet none betrayed aggression. Time itself felt slightly distorted, an elongated second for some, a barely noticeable instant for others. The shadow's body remained upright, composed, yet the impetus for continuation had been removed, stripped of forward intent without humiliation or overt force. Bruce's attention did not waver. His breathing, slow and deliberate, controlled the rhythm of the space. His stance remained anchored, weight distributed evenly. Micro-adjustments in place to absorb or deflect further motion if necessary. The dojo's equilibrium had been restored, though no one had needed to intervene directly. The subtle mastery of balance, timing, and restraint had resolved a potential escalation before it became visible. Students and witnesses felt the change before they understood it. Eyes widened, hands released tension. A collective breath seemed to escape the room simultaneously. The sense of imminent danger faded, leaving in its wake an almost imperceptible hum of relief. Yet the weight of what had occurred lingered. A lesson in precision, in restraint, and in the invisible power of awareness. The shadow remained stationary, unmoved by any further impulse, the threat neutralized without spectacle, without a single overt blow. Bruce's micro-actions, executed with minimal motion and maximum control, had determined the outcome. The silence that followed carried the gravity of resolution. The dojo had witnessed the assertion of authority not through force, but through exact timing and nuanced control. And in that stillness, almost as if nothing had happened, it was understood. The conflict had ended. The true measure of skill, the decisive movement, had occurred in the quietest fraction of a second, leaving no dramatic mark, but leaving the lesson indelible. The tension dissolved, and yet the memory of precise, humane control would remain with everyone present. Unspoken, but unmistakable. Bruce released the slight contact and stepped aside, returning to a stance that was calm, deliberate, and unassuming. The shadowed figure remained upright, frozen in position, yet the forward momentum had vanished entirely. No one clapped, no voice broke the thick, measured quiet. The dojo seemed suspended in the stillness that followed, as though holding its breath in recognition of a resolution that required no announcement. The air shifted subtly, warmer now, less compressed, as the tension dispersed almost as quickly as it had appeared. For a long moment, all was quiet, except for the soft, ordinary sounds of the room, the scrape of tatami under weight, a gentle inhale or exhale, the rustle of fabric as students adjusted their posture. The master, the first to break the suspended attention, lowered his gaze slowly, inclining his head in a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no explanation. Bruce responded in kind, a slight, respectful nod. The gesture carried weight precisely because it was restrained, an exchange of mutual understanding rather than triumph. Eyes that had been wide with anticipation softened, shoulders eased from taut tension, and subtle movements resumed. The rhythm of the room returned, small foot adjustments, gentle shifts of the hips, the quiet sound of breathing regaining its usual cadence. The observers felt a collective exhale, not relief in the theatrical sense, but the deep, unspoken recognition of mastery, of authority exercised without aggression. The shadowed figure, still standing, did not retreat, nor did they advance. The action that might have become a confrontation had been resolved in the subtlest fraction of a second, a motion so precise it could easily have been mistaken for chance. Yet everyone present, in ways that only later could be articulated, understood that what had passed was decisive. It was a demonstration not of dominance, but of control, awareness, and restraint. An assertion of principle without inflicting injury or humiliation. Bruce's own body relaxed incrementally, shoulders dropping, hands lowering to rest naturally at his sides. His expression remained calm, composed, reflecting nothing of triumph, only the measured satisfaction of a moment handled with absolute precision. Students and masters alike absorbed the lesson silently. A display of authority does not require force. Timing and subtlety can dictate outcomes more definitively than any visible strike. The dojo seemed to exhale collectively, the latent pressure dissipating, replaced by a quiet gravity. Every micro-sound, the slight squeak of floorboards, a faint creak in the structure, soft shuffles of clothing, returned to ordinary perception, yet carried the memory of the previous tension. The room, once suspended in charged anticipation, resumed its normal rhythm, each participant attuned to the lessons of awareness, control, and restraint they had witnessed. In that calm, measured aftermath, the true weight of the encounter became evident. There was no winner, no loser. The moment transcended conventional judgment. The story would be told afterward in fragments, each retelling shaped by individual perception, yet everyone would remember the same core. The decisive motion had been nearly invisible, executed in a single, precise instant. And though it was fleeting, almost imperceptible, that subtle act, resolving potential conflict without aggression, etched itself into memory more strongly than any visible blow could. It left the dojo intact, the integrity of its space unbroken, and imparted a lesson in mastery that would endure far longer than the brief moment itself.